So often we talk about, the fear of failure and how all of us, it stagnates us and paralyzes us from really taking a step forward. And this is a very complicated discussion as to how do you overcome a fear of failure, how do you develop a risk-taking ability. And I don't think any of us are born in with it, but I think a lot of it goes behind the conditioning that we've grown up with. If we've grown up in families where you've seen people taking risk, you're probably more comfortable with it. If you've grown up in families where stability is more important, then probably that's something which is not so natural to you. It also depends on whether you're male or female. Women in our country are not encouraged to take risk and are actually encouraged to seek safety as much as possible. And therefore, you rarely get the challenge of actually overcoming your fear because usually you're protected and kept comfortable, which usually boys are not. So I think a lot of our conditioning makes up who we are, but let's assume for today that I am someone who has a fear of failure, and let's assume I'm someone who doesn't have a risk-taking ability. How do I deal with that, and what do I do with it? The first thing to remember is that the minute you know and you're self-aware that you are fearful, that's the first thing to discover. Most of us are not willing or accepting to realize what our weaknesses are, and we're not accepting to accept our vulnerabilities. So the first step is self-awareness and to recognize that in ourselves. The second step, once we've recognized that, and that recognition can happen by talking to friends, hearing from our parents, or talking to a therapist or a counselor who could guide us and help us discover what our true innate nature is. Once we've discovered and we're self-aware about whether we actually have this fear of failure, the second question is, look, how do I develop my risk-taking ability? When you diagnose yourself as having that fear, you've also got to figure out why that is. Is it because you grew up in a certain gender? Is it because you grew up in a certain family? Is it just inherently who you are? And then discover as to where that came from. This is a very important part of discovering the root, because unless you discover the root, you won't be able to unravel the steps for the future. The third step is, after you've discovered the root of this, is to actually start tackling those fears head on. And what I mean by that is that, for example, let's say somebody has a fear of heights. Usually when somebody has a fear of heights, they avoid tall buildings, they avoid mountains, they avoid anything that causes that anxiety. And the minute you avoid something that causes that anxiety, it actually shockingly increases your anxiety. Because the minute you avoid it, it means you're telling yourself that, look, I can't deal with this, it's too much, it's too overwhelming for me to deal with, and you continue to remain scared of that height. But the minute you say, you know what, I'm afraid of this height, and the only way I can stop being afraid of these heights is by actually confronting it. And you go to that tall building, you go for a trek, you go mountaineering, and you go through your nervousness and go through your anxiety. And when you reach back at the bottom of the mountain or the bottom of the stairs, and you're not at a height anymore, Viola, you realize that you actually were able to get through it, and that builds your confidence and actually helps you overcome that fear. And now suddenly, fear of heights is not on the list of your fears anymore. So the only way to get through the fear is actually to confront it, deal with the nervousness, deal with the anxiety, come out on the other side and be uncomfortable, because it's only through that discomfort that you will get comfort. And that's the only way. In my experience, I've grown up in a family where we never took debt, we saved. 80% of our income went into savings. Nobody was really in the business world. I had never seen anyone take a lot of risk. But I grew up actually trekking and mountaineering, and my parents brought me up in a very progressive way where I was very independent. And because of both of these things, I actually had an ability to take my own independent decisions and take risks as well. And it's through that I started to learn how to take risk in business. I started to confront my fears. I remember the first time I took debt, it was a large amount. I couldn't sleep. I used to wake up at 4 in the morning with panic attacks because I had 600 crores of debt on my head. And at the age of 35, that wasn't a great place to be. And I used to wake up in panic attacks, sweating. And I went through that period. I came out of it by dealing with it, by making my business grow faster than the rate of the debt. And I feel a more confident and happy person for having confronted it. So here's to it, make a list. A lot of people make bucket lists of the things they want to do. I say make a bucket list of fears and start attempting each one of them today.